Brazil, India, China and Russia remain firmly in Donald Trump's sights as targets for his tariffs. Others, like the EU, have caved and negotiated deals. But for those who haven't, could the US president's confrontational stance forge new alliances against him? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finighan. US President Donald Trump is waging an aggressive tariff strategy against friend and foe alike. Some have caved, the EU capitulating quickly rather than engaging in a prolonged trade war. Trump is justifying the barrage of duties on economic grounds to even out trade balances that he says rip off the US. But some measures, either imposed or threatened, are politically motivated. Russia and India are targets because of the Ukraine war and their oil trade. Brazil is facing punitive trade taxes of 50%, driven by the prosecution of former President Jair Bolsonaro, a Trump ally accused of plotting a coup. China has refused to bow to US demands, but in a reflection of their complex trade relations, talks are continuing. So could President Trump's tough tactics lead to new alliances against him? What leverage do the different sides have, the US and the economies Trump seeks to tame with tariffs? We'll discuss all of that with our guests shortly, but first, this report from Felix Narwara.
Disruptions to global trade have become a defining feature of Donald Trump's second term. Since April the 2nd, his so-called Liberation Day, the US president has introduced new export duties on up to 90 countries, targeting both traditional allies as well as nations on the margins of trade with the US. Europe, for instance, enjoyed single-digit tariffs until last month. They jumped to 15% after the EU accepted higher levies without a fight or imposing reciprocal duties, seeking to avoid a trade war. It's a different story in Brazil. The US imposed a 50% trade tax on all its goods, with Trump demanding an end to what he called the witch hunt against former President Jair Bolsonaro, who is charged with plotting a coup. Brazil has hit back strongly, with no deal in sight.
We are not some insignificant republic. It's unacceptable to try to use a political issue to tax us economically.
India has also been targeted. Its purchases of Russian oil have put it in Trump's crosshairs. In response, New Delhi has accused Washington of double standards because it also buys substantial volumes of goods from Moscow.
The relationship with Russia, of course, goes way back to the time of the Cold War, when India was not going to choose sides. And the United States took umbrage at that and tried to force India into a coalition against Soviet communism.
With India's neighbor China, trade negotiations continue after Beijing refused to bow to what it termed as US bullying. While Russia could face tougher sanctions if it refuses to strike a ceasefire deal with Ukraine. Countries hit by US tariffs are increasingly turning to each other, forging new alliances to bypass US influence on global trade. Felix Narwara, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests. Einar Tangen is a China specialist and senior fellow at the Taihe Institute. He joins us from Beijing. In Pretoria is Gustavo de Carvalho, a senior researcher in the geopolitics of the Global South at the South African Institute of International Affairs. And in Split, Croatia, David McWilliams, an economist, author and podcast host. Gentlemen, a warm welcome to you all. Just a brief caveat for anyone watching or listening to Inside Story. We're having this discussion on Wednesday afternoon, Doha time, the same time in Moscow, as US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff meets President Putin ahead of President Trump's Friday deadline for Russia to make progress on ending the war in Ukraine or face along with its trading partners, punitive secondary tariffs. Obviously, we can't predict the outcome of that meeting or whether those secondary tariffs are going to be applied. All we've got at this moment is the Kremlin saying that the talks were positive and constructive. So if we can, we'll leave secondary tariffs aside for the moment. We will talk about it, but not immediately. Einar, to what extent is President Trump forcing a reworking of the global trade order that won't necessarily be to the US or his benefit? Are his policies going to backfire on the US and US consumers?
Well, they already have. I mean, tariffs are not paid by other countries. They're paid by American consumers. When the goods are brought to the ports, it's the people who import them that have to pay the tariffs. So that's not going to work well with the American people. But in terms of internationally, this kind of blatant bullying, fired off 180 unilateral tariffs, and then it was followed up by just recently, about half that many. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. And now his ire seems to be on Brics. Why? Very simply, he sees it as a competing faction, one that represents 40% of the world's GDP, more than double the U.S., has the most amount of resources, has the most amount of population, and has the most amount of manufacturing. So right now, he's isolating the U.S. under the theory that the U.S. is isolating everybody else.
Gustavo, is Trump forcing nations like South Africa and the other BRICS nations closer together in terms of trade and cooperation more generally? And could the bloc and the alliances that it forms with other nations eventually become the world's dominant economic force?
Indeed. And if we see what happened last month with the BRICS summit in Rio de Janeiro, it was particularly interesting that BRICS countries were very cautious not to single out the United States directly. There was no direct mentioning to the US, and particularly because many of the members felt that a confrontation with the US was not beneficial to them at that stage. What we've seen since the BRICS summit is direct action towards Brazil, towards India. We had already seen many of these actions towards South Africa earlier in the year, which means that this cautious and paced approach that BRICS countries have taken in terms of the creation of its own system of payments, in terms of the use of local currencies on trade, there is a different incentive now. That incentive tends to strangely strengthen the role of BRICS as a viable and important mechanism that strengthens the role of these countries. And for those countries that had somehow of a sense of, we are not so sure how deep we want to go with some of these structures, some of these expectations are changing now. So it will be interesting to see what happens in the coming weeks and months. Brazil still holds the presidency of BRICS until December this year, and India is taking over the presidency of BRICS from the beginning of next year. So
David,
all of those, really what we see now is a change of environments and trends that it's particularly useful for the strengthening of BRICS as a group.
David, what do you think? Are we getting ahead of ourselves on the BRICS nations here? Could Trump's tariffs break the BRICS and other nations' dependency upon the US and trade in the dollar? Gustavo mentioned trade settlement systems. Could we see another currency or trade settlement system that eventually bypasses the US dollar to become the dominant one?
Well, Adrian, there's a lot to digest in that question. I think it's appropriate that we are having this discussion on the 80th anniversary of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, which marked the end of the Second World War. After that, an extremely confident United States created what we now know to be the world's financial architecture. The World Bank, the IMF, run by the dollar, as you said, with America nudging its allies and its foes towards liberalization, open markets, free trade, all that stuff. So what Mr. Trump is doing is he's actually, I'm not sure if he's aware of this or not, but he's breaking up an 80-year global settlement, the 80-year global status quo. Now, what replaces that, I'm not absolutely 100% sure, but I am sure that something will replace it, because Einar gave the figures there. You know, the BRICS are by far and away the most important population, the biggest GDP together, and crucially, they have the resources which the rest of the world needs. So my point is, you've got to take a couple of decade-long perspective of this, you know, to actually dispense with just the short-term ideas and think decades long. My own fear for the United States is the currency issue that you have mentioned, Adrian, and as Gustavo mentioned, because one of the key soft power aspects of the United States over the last many decades has been the power of the dollar, the fact that we all need dollars to settle trades. If that is no longer the case, if people can settle raw materials, commodities, etc., in non-dollars, then the United States has a power, because having the dollar gives it an amazing potency. And I think Mr. Trump is messing with that. I'm not too sure he has thought about the significance of a dollar debasement over time.
Einar, do you agree with that? To what extent is Trump being incredibly short-sighted here, perhaps even ignorant, in that his tariffs may deliver short-term political wins for him, but long-term strategic losses?
Well, I would dispute that there are any wins in this by, literally corralling everybody who you should be friendly with and making them into enemies. I also would split hairs. I don't think the U.S. nudged countries. They actively interfered, as the 72 revealed regime change operations and many others that weren't revealed testify to. Donald Trump, obviously, he doesn't seem to have an understanding of things. And if you start listening to the people who were close to him during his first term, they say he doesn't read anything. He doesn't understand history. He doesn't care about it. He cares about the market, which isn't doing too well. He cares about his polling, which is even doing worse. And he cares about the news, which is not treating him too nicely, especially with all this Epstein stuff. So right now, he's kind of in shock. He's trying to figure out how he can change the narrative. And he thinks that perhaps this is the issue. Instead of just talking about China getting tough with America, I'm going to say it's a gang of countries that are coming after America. Remember, his big card throughout his elections and even during his presidency has been this victimhood, that the most powerful, richest, most militarily potent power in the world has been victimized by countries who can't feed themselves. It doesn't make any sense to anybody outside the U.S., but there are many people within who feel that, yes, somehow they've been cheated because, it's a rich country, but they're not seeing it.
I'll come to you in a moment, Gustavo. I just want to get David's reaction to that. Trump he may be president of the United States, but he's not coming up with economic policy on his own. Who on earth is advising him then if all of this is so short-sighted?
Well, there does seem to be an extraordinary rogues gallery of quasi-qualified, semi-qualified characters whispering in his ear. My own sense is that we've got to step back a bit. A tariff is a tax on the American people. So what Donald Trump is doing is he's inaugurating maybe the biggest tax that was ever levied at one point on American consumers. So this can't make Americans rich. That's the first thing. But the second thing is, if you have a reasonably disunited movement called Brics, and you throw on top of that an enemy called the United States, well, then nothing will more galvanize the Brics than the United States creating an enemy. And the last point I'll make is, Einar was talking about this combination. It's a very strange one. You see it in a lot of regimes at the moment and administrations, a combination of profound self-confidence and extraordinary victimhood at the same time. And these two things go together, make for very poor medium-term policies. Because why? You think everybody's against you, number one, but you also think you're better than everybody else, number two. And as against that sort of background, I think this is maybe the most potent and sulfuric combination that is exploding as we speak in the White House.
Gustavo, is the BRICS alliance robust enough, strong enough to come up with a coordinated response to Trump at the moment?
No, I would say BRICS countries have so far played a fairly loose structure in terms of where do they see themselves. Certainly, the incentives that are created with the actions from the United States at the moment create new momentum for it. I think to a large extent, I think what we need to look into now is that what it does is that it pushes countries to diversify their economies, to look for new partners. If we look within the trade structure within BRICS, we all trade a lot with China, but we trade very little with one another. So what this does is that for countries like Brazil with their 50% tariffs is to start looking for partners that reduces the risk that the United States poses. The same with South Africa and the same with India. So what we expect to see here really is a group that starts seeing itself perhaps less of looking into narratives like we've seen in the last few years, that BRICS is not an anti-West, but rather a non-Western entity, to fast track the work within central banks to ensure that even though the creation of a new currency is not even on the cards within BRICS at the moment, but perhaps what countries would start seeing now is to ensure that many of these baseline mechanisms, whether it's through integration of banking systems, whether it's through harmonizations of standards between these countries, that provide those options. Because at the moment, not only the global order is seen as a very risky one, but the largest economy in the world is increasingly perceived as the largest source of instability that has a direct threatening impact to the stability of the economy, to the economic growth. So what it does effectively is perhaps not necessarily to place BRICS as the alternative to the United States, but it certainly provides a much more stronger narrative for a coherent approach for fast tracking some of these processes that already exist, and perhaps a little bit less of concerns about some of those plausible deniabilities around what BRICS wants to do. BRICS has not been an anti-American entity so far, but what we see now is the reverse, where the United States presents itself openly as an anti-BRICS entity that will inevitably lead to responses from the leaders of all of the different 10 countries that are part of BRICS at the moment.
I know, picking up on what Gustavo was saying, just as an aside here at the moment, because I think people will be interested, what's China's view on Trump's use of economic measures to interfere in other countries' domestic and therefore sovereign matters, such as we've seen in both South Africa and in Brazil?
Well, I mean, going into the election, I think it would have been very hard to find anybody in the government who'd say they favored one or the other in terms of Biden or Trump. But today, I think it's pretty universally recognized that Donald Trump is the greatest gift to China that America has given. The fact is that he has turned neighbors, allies into enemies, if not enemies, as to feeling that they have to de-risk from an unreliable U.S., as Gustavo was talking about. So, I mean, at this point, China just is sitting back and watching the mayhem. They're not pushing anything. They're just simply saying, look, it's as I told you. Adrian, you were talking earlier, we were talking about how, the BRICS just had a meeting. Xi Jinping did not go. And at the meeting, it was clear that Brazil and India were trying to hedge a little bit, saying, look, we should just, not get too heavily involved in blaming the U.S. Let's, just play it safe, get in between here, not make choices. Now, Donald Trump is forcing to them. You tell me what any one of these countries has to lose under what Donald Trump is not only doing, but threatening to do more of. And remember, he said another 10%. And if there's any talk about replacing the dollar, it'll be 100%. Well, we know he's the taco king. He always chickens out. But the fact is, this is not helping these capitals. And right now, he's literally, as you started out, he's pushing everybody together in ways. I disagree a little bit with Gustavo. I think they are coming together because they realize they don't have any other choice. And how's the old saying goes, we don't hang together, we will hang separately.
David, what happens to the global economy then if Trump goes ahead with this threat and introduces secondary tariffs on any country that buys Russian oil? What might the removal of Russian oil from the market do to inflation, for example? Will countries, including Russia itself, find ways around the measures?
Look, Adrian, we've been here before. We know that when tariffs are introduced, as they were in the 1930s, the impact on global trade is phenomenally negative. The impact on deflation and the Depression was only offset by the fact that unemployment rose so much. So there's no economic textbook which will tell you that imposing unilateral or reciprocal tariffs across the board in this absolutely haphazard manner will do anything other than undermine confidence, which undermines investment, which means firms retrench, which means in certain places, and you mentioned Russian oil, there will be choke points because the United States simply does not produce enough of the stuff that it imports, which is why there's a deficit in the first place. Now, what happens when you close those off, or when you open up the possibility of reciprocal and tit-for-tat tariffs, what you do is you run the risk in the United States, in particular, of them running out of certain products. Now, this is a very real prospect. This is how the economy works. So I would say that what Mr. Trump is doing is he's playing not just with fire, but as I said before, with something much more explosive, which is a system that the United States put in place 80 years ago, which they benefited enormously from. Even in the last 25 years, the United States has benefited enormously from open trade with all its farmers or former allies or even former enemies. And my fear is that the global economy gets hit by a massive, massive knock to confidence. And what you have is a retrenchment of investment, then consumption, and we go into a tailspin.
Gustavo, just on this issue of secondary tariffs, if Donald Trump goes ahead with this threat, India has much to lose. It's accusing the West, India that is, particularly the EU, of double standards when it comes to Russian energy. And it even claims that it was encouraged to continue buying Russian oil to maintain market stability when Russia invaded Ukraine. I mean, is it right when it accuses the West of being just as guilty as those that it's currently blaming for enabling Russia's war machine?
Precisely. And I think there is the irony of a lot of what is happening now with India is that there is a very simple economic reason for why India has been buying so much oil from Russia. When the sanctions were placed into Russia in 2022, there was an understanding that by disrupting too much of the oil sector would create a spillover effect throughout the global economy. What was the response? Let's create then an oil price cap that would reduce the profits of the Russians, which would make countries like India to realize there is a great business to be done here. So when they are buying more oil from the Russians, that is primarily because there was a system designed in which created all of those incentives for them to buy the crude oil from Russia, to refine them within India and to re-export to make profits out of it. And then on top of that, we've certainly seen that European countries and the United States have not entirely stopped trading with Russia in terms of energy, in terms of different sectors. We see countries like Germany, for instance, still trading over $8 billion with Russia a year. We still see the United States buying lots of uranium from Russia. And so there is the issue, I think, is beyond double standards. I think there is no standards or clarity around what is presented within that, and that is how it affects countries like India and the rest of the global south.
I need a reasonably brief answer from you here because time is running out. China is the biggest buyer of Russian oil currently. If Trump were introduced secondary tariffs on nations that buy it, what would China do?
Well, China has its own cards, and obviously that would include, these very, very important minerals that are used in all of the advanced technology. This they can use. It would grind America's entire military, machine to a halt. You can't do it without these heavy earths. So at this point, China has a lot more options than that. if the U.S. wants to do that. Remember, go back to what David said. This is all being paid for by the United States citizens, and it's regressive. And the regressive people it's hitting hardest are the ones that voted most for Donald Trump. So this is going to have repercussions that go beyond our discussion merely of the international situation to the domestic one.
David, picking up on that point, your point about US consumers paying for it, is it just going to be US consumers? Even without secondary tariffs, will Trump's reworking, I think we've established, I think we've established that Trump's reworking of the global trade order won't result in a fairer system with a more even distribution of wealth. It'll be probably more chaotic and costly, but to what extent are we, all of us, you, Einar, Gustavo, me, anyone watching or listening, going to be the losers in this battle, all thanks to Trump?
We will all be the losers in this battle. Our problem is that self-confident countries do not introduce tariffs. Nervous, anxious countries introduce tariffs because they fear foreign competition. That's the first thing. Second thing is American consumers will be worse off. We know that. And thirdly, because the American consumer is in himself and herself a dynamo of global economic growth, they're very, very undermining from the tariffs will undermine global trade. So there's no world in which this works out well. All right.
There, I'm afraid we're going to have to end it. Gentlemen, many thanks indeed to you all. Einar Tangen, Gustavo de Carvalho, and David McWilliams. And thanks for watching. You can see the programme again at any time by going to the website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, you can join us on our Facebook page. You'll find that at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, you can join the conversation on X. Our handle there is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finighan, and the team here in Doha, we'll see you again. Bye for now.
Don't miss out. Get the full picture. Subscribe to Al Jazeera for reliable news, expert insight. Like, share, stay ahead.